interesting insights with you around this theme of when people are at their best, organizations are at their best. And it's such a powerful, powerful message. But how do you actually do it? And when I say how do you actually do it, I don't mean what your organization should be doing for you. I mean, what should you specifically as an individual actually do so that you can be at your best, so that your organization can be at its best? And I think it really comes down to two things. The first is acknowledging that you have gaps, that you can get better, that you can learn, that you can grow, that you can become more agile. And the second part of this is actually taking steps to do those things, taking steps to learn new things, taking steps to grow, to be more agile. That's exactly what this concept of leading with vulnerability is all about. Those gaps, and then taking those steps to actually close those gaps. But this is a very uncomfortable thing because it requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is something a lot of us, especially in the business world, we don't like. We freak out about it. It's something that's very uncomfortable even for me. So I grew up raised by two immigrant parents. They came from the Republic of Georgia. Not a lot of people are familiar with that part of the world. Former USSR. And growing up, my mom would always try to teach me about emotional openness and vulnerability. But as a young boy, I grew up watching my dad. And my dad was the exact opposite of that. My dad was the don't show emotion, don't talk about your feelings, don't burden other people with your problems. Try to be number one mentally and physically. Don't share with anybody. And that's how I grew up for pretty much my entire adult life. Even to this day, when I go visit my parents, my dad opens the door and he's like, "Jacob, come to the backyard. Let me see how many push-ups and pull-ups you can do." I'm like, oh, God. Literally every time, he's always got some physical test that he wants to put me through to just show how tough and macho we are. And that's how I grew up. Until one day, something happened to me that completely changed my life. But before I tell you what that is, I want to first introduce the concept, the big question that I wanted to ask with this book. Is vulnerability for leaders the same as it is for everybody else? Now, we all understand the importance and power of vulnerability in our personal lives. It's what helps create connections and relationships. It's what helps create bonds with friends, with family members, with our spouses, our significant others. But is vulnerability at work the same? Inside of an organization, you have leaders, you have projects, you have deadlines, you have customers, you're being paid a salary. Is vulnerability at work the same as it is in your personal life? And when I was interviewing 100 CEOs when doing research for this book, that was one of the questions I was asking all of them. And a lot of these CEOs were very conflicted because they were telling me that on the one hand, their employees wanted them to be strong and competent and visionary. They wanted to have ideas for future problems. They wanted to be able to innovate and come up with these future scenarios and the growth of the company. But on the other hand, these same employees were asking their leaders to talk about their challenges and their mistakes, their failures, their emotions, how they're feeling. And so these CEOs were conflicted. They're like, what kind of a leader am I supposed to be? The strong, competent, visionary leader, or the leader who talks about my feelings and challenges and failures and emotions? And it's a very interesting challenge for a lot of leaders to figure out. So a lot of these executives acknowledge that vulnerability is important, but they also acknowledge that inside of an organization, it's different, and that vulnerability for leaders is different than it is for non-leaders. These are two gentlemen who you may or may not recognize. The first is Hollis Harris on your left over there. He's the former CEO of Continental Airlines. And in the late 80s, early 90s, Continental Airlines was going through a very tough time. And so the board asked Hollis Harris to talk about and address what's going on with the business and to send out a memo to the workforce. So he drafts a memo, he sends it out, he talks about the internal, the external factors, the challenges, all the things that are going on. And he ends his memo by saying the best thing that you as an employee can do for Continental Airlines is to pray for the future of this company. The next day, he was fired. Now, this story was told to me by Doug Parker. He recently retired as the CEO of American Airlines. And he correctly pointed out that what Hollis Harris did was vulnerable, but there was no leadership. Now, contrast this to a story about Fleetwood Grobler. He's the CEO of a South African energy company called Sasol. When he took over as CEO, the company was $13 billion in debt. The banks were about to come in and repossess the business. It was going to disappear off the face of the earth. And similarly, his board came to him, first-time CEO, and they said, address the workforce. He gave a slightly different message. And he talked about the vulnerability, and he said, I know that we're going through a tough time. And I don't know exactly how we're going to get out of this tough time. But here's what I do know. We have an amazing group of people that are here, and I have a vision for where our business can go. And if you come with me on this journey, we can rebuild trust in the eyes of our customers and in our employees, and we could turn this business around and become successful. And that's exactly what they did. They were able to turn the business around. So there is a big difference between being vulnerable versus leading with vulnerability. And I always tell executives, and actually anybody with a job, do not be vulnerable at work. Instead, lead with vulnerability. That's where the agility comes from. That's where closing the skills gap comes from. So let me give you a couple examples of the difference between vulnerability versus leading with vulnerability. Let's say your boss gives you a project to do, and you mess it up. Vulnerability is going to your boss at the time and saying, I am so sorry I messed this up. I know how important it was. I'm sorry. That's vulnerability. And your leader at the time might look at you and say, okay, and the customer is still unhappy. The product is still not ready. The numbers have still not been met. Our deadlines have still not been met. So in other words, it's good to have that psychological safety where you can feel like you can be vulnerable, but simply going to your leader at the time and talking about the gaps and the mistakes and the problems and the challenges is not going to help you at work. In fact, it'll probably hurt you far more than it can help you. If you take that same scenario and apply the leadership concept to it, instead you'll say something like this. I know how important this project was. I'm sorry I messed it up. Here's what I learned from the mistake that I made, and here are 3 things that I'm going to do to make sure that that mistake never happens again. Vulnerability is about exposing a gap that you have, a gap in experience, a gap in competence, a gap in whatever it might be, a gap in skills. Leading with vulnerability is about exposing that gap that you have and demonstrating what you are trying to do to close that gap. That is the big difference, and especially at work, where you are hired to do something, it's not good enough to just talk about the gaps that you have. Your team, your leaders, your employees, they want to know what you're trying to do to close that gap. So a vulnerable leader is a leader who intentionally opens themselves up to the potential of emotional harm. That's what vulnerability is. But then takes action to create a positive outcome. Takes action to create a positive outcome. That is what we forget to do inside of our organizations today. And I think post-pandemic, we've over-indexed on the vulnerability, and we've forgotten about the competence. We've forgotten about the leadership. And one of the big things that I think we're starting to see for 2024 is that organizations are talking more about competence, more about skills, more about performance. Not that vulnerability is not important, but these 2 things have to go hand in hand. So if there's one thing that you remember from anything that I talk about today, I hope it's this. Very simple. The vulnerable leader equation. Vulnerability plus leadership equals vulnerable leadership. Vulnerability plus leadership.